Welcome to our channel. Before we get started, please consider liking and subscribing so we can bring more stories like this to you. I never thought I'd end up going toe-to-toe with an HOA president, let alone end up in a police station because of it. I moved into a cozy over 55 community a year ago, hoping for a quiet retirement. Most of my neighbors seemed amiable, people who valued morning walks and friendly banter on their front lawns. But everything changed when our new HOA president, Marla, took charge. Marla was the quintessential busybody. She'd snap on latex gloves to pick up the tiniest piece of litter on the street and leave neatly typed warning notices in mailboxes about holiday decorations that were up an hour too long. I'd heard rumors that she'd always longed for a position of authority, and after our previous, and far more reasonable, president moved away, she campaigned hard for the role. She won by a single vote, and from that moment on, it felt like we were living in her private kingdom. At first, Marla's ideas seemed only mildly over the top. She demanded that everyone keep porch lights turned on for exactly 4 hours each evening to maintain visual consistency. Then she decreed that every homeowner purchase a specific brand of lawn fertilizer. Inconvenient, sure, but not outrageous. I tried to keep an open mind, telling myself that perhaps she just had a strong sense of order. Many folks shrugged it off, preferring not to stir up confrontation. "She'll calm down eventually," they'd say. "It's just new president jitters." But then Marla unveiled her grand plan, a mandatory emergency supply fund that each resident would be required to pay into every month. She framed it as a way to keep our community safe and secure. She wanted to build a large storage closet in the clubhouse where we'd keep supplies, flashlights, bottled water, canned food, and medical kits. On the surface, it sounded helpful. After all, we'd had a few power outages in the last year due to storms. However, Marla's proposed fee was astronomical, nearly double our current monthly dues. People were aghast. We all wanted to be prepared for emergencies, but tripling our HOA budget for a bunch of flashlights and bandages seemed absurd. Marla insisted the cost would cover ongoing maintenance, professional pest control for the storage area, and monthly restocking. She even mentioned unexpected overhead fees that were too complicated to break down at the moment. As a retired accountant, I bristled at the lack of detail. Where exactly was this money going? I asked to see a line-item budget. Marla only handed me a short bullet list with vague terms like supplies, logistics, and planning support. She refused to show me a breakdown or name any of her vendors. My gut told me something was off, but I also noticed that a few of my neighbors were eager to trust her. Marla always had a way of dazzling certain folks with big promises. "This will turn our neighborhood into a model community," she'd say. "We'll be the envy of every HOA in the region." The first warning sign came when I went to a monthly meeting to discuss the new budget. Usually, these gatherings involved a handful of retirees chatting and munching on donuts. This time, the atmosphere was tense. Marla stood at the front of the room with a projector, flashing slides of worst-case scenarios: tornadoes, riots, floods. She claimed we could be left with no resources 4 days on end if we didn't properly prepare now. Some neighbors began to panic, especially those without families nearby. They worried about how they'd manage without electricity or medication. Marla leveraged that fear perfectly. I raised my hand and calmly asked if we could explore more cost-effective ways to build our supply or see if there was a regional program we could join. Marla's expression tightened. She dismissed my suggestion, saying it was too risky to wait for external help. Then she moved on, not letting me follow up. A day later, a letter landed in my mailbox, an official-looking one with the HOA's logo, stating that I was out of compliance for questioning the board's emergency initiative without going through the proper channels. It warned that continued interference could result in fines or other measures. It was ridiculous. There was no rule stating that a homeowner couldn't ask questions about the budget. I suspected this was Marla's way of intimidating me. The bizarre part was that after the letter, a few neighbors approached me privately to say they'd gotten similar notices just because they'd voiced concerns about the cost. But nobody wanted to make a fuss. "You know how she is," an elderly neighbor told me in a whisper. "I don't want her on my case." It seemed like everyone feared retribution. 2 weeks later, we all received the new HOA invoice, Monthly fees had more than doubled, effective immediately. There was a glaring note at the bottom in bold: non-payment may result in legal action. Within days, rumors flew that Marla was using the extra funds for renovations on her own property. Someone claimed they'd seen contractors frequently coming and going from Marla's house. Another neighbor whispered that Marla was planning to funnel some of the money into an HOA-sponsored travel fund for conferences she was attending. I felt uneasy. I'm not the type to start drama, but I also refused to let intimidation stand. Before I made any accusations, I decided to gather concrete evidence. I combed through the HOA bylaws and realized Marla was potentially pushing through these fees without proper approval. She had also failed to present an official budget for the emergency supply closet. Something was definitely not adding up. That's when I decided to do a little digging. And that's when things took a very sharp turn, straight into police involvement. I began my investigation innocently enough. As a retired accountant, I'm skilled at following paper trails, so my plan was to review the HOA's recent bank statements. But to do that, I needed the board's permission, or at least the treasurer's cooperation. Our treasurer, Glenn, was a quiet widower who'd been on the board for 3 years. He and I had never spoken much, but I caught him taking out the trash one morning and seized the opportunity. "Glenn," I said, "I'd like to see the statements for the past 6 months. I just want to verify how these new fees are being allocated." He looked over his shoulder, clearly wary. "Marla handles those now," he murmured. "She asked me to step back from bookkeeping since she's bringing in a new system." My eyebrows shot up. I knew Glenn was in charge of the HOA finances before Marla arrived. Stepping back from his treasurer duties sounded suspicious. "You're still the treasurer, aren't you?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He nodded reluctantly. "Technically, yes. But ever since Marla came on board, she keeps the records locked in the clubhouse office. I only see what she chooses to show me at meetings." He made it plain that he wasn't comfortable going against Marla, but hinted that if I found a way to look at those records, he wouldn't stop me. That was all I needed. I asked him if the clubhouse might be open for a short window before the next monthly meeting, when fewer people would be around. Glenn shrugged, saying he'd be out running errands, and gave me no further details. I got the hint. A few days later, I headed to the clubhouse at an odd hour. Sure enough, the main door was unlocked, likely for cleaning staff. The small office that housed the HOA records was, however, locked tight. There was no sign of a cleaning crew. I was about to walk away when I noticed the door was slightly ajar, like someone didn't fully close it. My heart pounded. Should I enter without explicit permission? I reasoned that as a homeowner, I had a right to see these records, and Glenn had indicated he wouldn't interfere. So I slipped inside. Stacks of papers were piled haphazardly on a wooden desk. This definitely didn't look like the new system Marla had touted. I thumbed through the top file and saw a series of checks made out to a name I didn't recognize: Starlight Consulting. The memo lines read Community Preparedness or Supply Management. The amounts were huge, each check was for thousands of dollars. My alarm bells rang. Why would an HOA in a modest retirement community be funneling so much money to a single consulting firm? I quickly snapped photos with my phone, carefully flipping through to find more. Then I spotted something even stranger: a set of receipts from a local home improvement store. They were for landscaping materials, brand new carpeting, and fancy kitchen appliances. The shipping address was listed as Marla's home. My mouth went dry. This wasn't just suspicious, it looked like outright embezzlement. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Panicking, I stuffed the papers back into the folder and stepped behind the door. A moment later, in walked Marla, phone pressed to her ear. I froze, worried she'd hear me breathing. "Yes, I know," she snapped into the phone, "I already deposited the checks." "No, it's not an issue, nobody's going to look that closely." She paused, listening. "Glenn? He's harmless. I've got him under control, so there's no problem there." She gave a bitter laugh. "These old folks around here can barely figure out their own DVRs. Trust me, it's fine." I felt a hot surge of anger. Our community deserved better than this. Someone was pilfering our HOA funds under the guise of emergency preparedness. I inched backward, hoping to slip out undetected. But of course, I nudged a file box with my foot. It made a dull thunk. Marla whipped around, eyes narrowed. She ended her call abruptly. "What are you doing here?" she demanded. I forced a weak smile. "I was just, looking for the sign-up sheets for next month's potluck." Marla's face was a storm of suspicion. "You have no right to be snooping around." Before I could respond, she lunged for the folder on the desk. Her voice dropped dangerously. "I'd be careful if I were you. If I catch wind of any lies or rumors you spread, I'll make sure you regret it." At that moment, I decided it was pointless to argue. I slipped out the door, heart racing. Once I was home, I tried to calm my nerves. I had photographic evidence of what looked like blatant theft. The question was, what should I do next? I considered calling a special HOA meeting, but Marla controlled the schedule for those. If I tried, she'd likely find a way to block it. I thought about presenting the evidence directly to neighbors, but I worried about Marla's intimidation tactics. Then I recalled a neighbor who once mentioned her nephew was a police officer in a nearby city. Maybe I could get some unofficial advice about next steps. That evening, I met with that neighbor, Ruth, who was shocked to hear what I'd found. She suggested I quietly bring the information to the authorities and file a report. "Even if it's just a suspicion," Ruth said, "the police can advise you whether there's enough to open an investigation." I wrestled with the decision all night, not wanting to cause a full-scale scandal unless I was sure. But the more I thought about those checks and receipts, the angrier I became. This community was full of seniors on fixed incomes. Every extra dollar they paid was money they could have used for groceries or medication. Meanwhile, Marla appeared to be funneling it into her personal home upgrades. The next morning, I dialed the non-emergency line of our local police department. I explained that I had potential evidence of HOA misappropriation of funds. They invited me to come down in person with any documentation I had. I agreed. It felt surreal. Never in my life had I imagined I'd be at a police station explaining that my neighbor might be defrauding a retirement community. But there I was, gathering my phone, a flash drive of the photos, and my notes. Little did I know, Marla was a step ahead. She had her own plan, one that would land both of us in a legal quagmire. I arrived at the police station the following afternoon. A courteous officer named Delgado took my statement. He asked me about the checks, the receipts, and the suspicious budget. I handed over the photos from my phone, along with a written log of what I'd found. Delgado was patient, but he also seemed cautious. He said, "This is concerning, but it might be a civil matter involving HOA finances. Typically, that's handled in civil court unless there's clear criminal intent." I told him about Marla's intimidation, the locked office, and the enormous checks. Delgado frowned. "I'll pass this on to our financial crimes unit to take a look," he said. "If you discover anything else, let us know." He assured me he'd be in touch if they needed more information. Feeling guardedly optimistic, I walked out of the station. But as I was pulling into my driveway, I spotted a police cruiser parked on my street. My heart lurched. Did Delgado send someone to interview neighbors already? But no, the officer was standing on my front porch. And Marla was there too, arms crossed, looking triumphant. I barely had time to put the car in park before the officer approached. "Ms. Gordon," he asked, checking his notes. "We have a complaint from Ms. Marla G. that you illegally broke into the HOA office." I blinked, my pulse hammering. "Illegally broke in?" "I found the door open. It's a community space." Marla's lips twisted into a smirk. "Officer, this woman trespassed on private property and tampered with official records. I want to press charges. Our HOA has strict rules about unauthorized access to the office." I tried to reason with the policeman. "I'm a homeowner here. HOA offices are not private property in the usual sense. And I only looked at records that should be available for all residents to review." He glanced between the two of us, then exhaled slowly. He said to me, "We got a formal complaint. I need to ask you a few questions at the station." That's how I found myself back at the police station, this time in a small interrogation room. While I wasn't arrested, The officer needed a statement to determine whether charges were warranted. I explained everything again: the suspicious documents, the open door, my right as an HOA member to see financial records. Eventually, the police let me go with a warning that Marla might pursue a restraining order or press charges if she felt threatened. It was surreal. I'd gone to the police to report possible embezzlement, and now I was the one being threatened with legal action. The following day, I got a formal notice from the HOA's lawyer demanding I cease any unauthorized investigations and threatening a lawsuit for defamation if I publicly slandered Marla's name. They gave me a deadline to retract any statements I'd made. I felt my stomach turn. Was Marla really that brazen? Furious, I called a friend of mine who'd once worked as a paralegal. She helped me compose a response letter. We stated that I had a legal right to review the HOA financials and that my statements were factual, based on evidence. I included copies of the receipts in question and indicated I'd spoken with law enforcement. Apparently, that letter was enough to rattle the board of directors. Beyond Marla, there were 4 other members. 3 days later, one of the board members, Rosalie, asked to meet me in private. She told me she'd been suspicious for months. She'd never been shown any formal contracts with Starlight Consulting, nor had she approved such large checks. She believed Marla was forging signatures on certain documents. But Rosalie was scared to step forward. Now that a police report existed, Rosalie felt more comfortable. We decided to call a special meeting, forcing the board to address my allegations publicly. Marla tried to block the meeting, but Rosalie had found a clause in our bylaws: if 3 board members agree to a special session, it must be scheduled. Rosalie managed to convince the vice president and Glenn to sign on. The meeting was tense. About 50 residents showed up, many of them alarmed by rumors swirling around the neighborhood. Marla sat at the front, flanked by the HOA lawyer. I presented my photos and described what I'd found. Rosalie confirmed she'd never authorized those expenses. Glenn admitted that he hadn't handled any financial reports in months, raising more red flags. Marla's expression hardened. She accused me of orchestrating a vindictive smear campaign. That's when an unexpected hand rose in the audience. Mark, a retired judge who lived 2 streets over. I barely knew him, but I'll never forget his calm, clear voice. "I've looked at these bylaws," he said, "and it's obvious you've made unilateral financial decisions, Ms. G. You circumvented the board's oversight. I advise that we file a civil suit to freeze the HOA account until this is resolved. Otherwise, we risk further misuse of homeowner funds." A hush fell over the room. Marla was livid. She threatened countersuits and spat out accusations, but the tide was turning against her. The board voted right then to remove Marla as president, pending an investigation. She stormed out, shouting that we'd all regret this. Of course, that wasn't the end. Over the next month, the Financial Crimes Unit at the police station subpoenaed the HOA's banking records. As it turned out, Marla had been siphoning off thousands of dollars to pay for her home renovations. Starlight Consulting was a shell company run by her cousin. The receipts from the hardware store confirmed the scheme. Marla ended up facing criminal charges for fraud and forgery. Meanwhile, our HOA held new elections. Rosalie stepped up as interim president, with Glenn returning to his proper role as treasurer. The emergency supply closet was abandoned, and we reverted to our old dues. Some neighbors grumbled about the drama, but most were grateful the truth came to light before Marla drained our entire budget. As for me, I'll admit the whole ordeal left me shaken. I never imagined that in a quiet retirement community, I'd be presenting evidence to the police or enduring threats of legal action. But I also learned a valuable lesson about not underestimating how far some people will go for power and money, even under the guise of community spirit. In the end, our neighborhood did become safer, just not in the way Marla intended. By rooting out the corruption, we ensured that the residents could enjoy the retirement they deserved without the looming fear of exploitation. And when the dust settled, I realized something else. Sometimes, standing up to a Karen with too much authority is the best form of civic duty one can perform, even if it means taking a trip or two to the police station along the way.